Giddy up. Today is Sunday, February 26, 2017, and this is episode 185 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me tonight, as always, is Mr. Andrew Callett.
Hello, Jerry. How are you? Good, sir.
I'm super duper. How about you?
I'm good. And joining me, as usual, is my little feline Fiona sitting on the chair next to me.
Wow.
I think she wants credit one of these days because she's usually sitting next to me while I'm recording the podcast. So
she's kind of like your handler, huh?
more like, my master, because I respond to her needs as needed, such as feed me. Okay, now pet me.
I understand. So just a reminder that the thoughts and opinions we express in this podcast are ours and do not represent those of our employer. So
Indeed.
Yeah, so a couple of big things happened this week, and
coincidentally, you were on vacation.
Yeah, and I'd just like to say, hold it together while I'm out, man. Come on.
This seems to be a trend. Every time you go on vacation,
it's only a few days.
The internet attempts to burn down.
So one of the big stories over the last week was the SHA-1 collision, right?
Right. Well, it was a big news story, but is it really big news?
Well,
because it's not like we didn't see this coming for a long time.
No, and in fact, I would say in some ways it's kind of a success story, right? Because there's been a lot of people running around for quite some time trying to deprecate SHA-1. I think I don't remember where it landed with certificates. I know that one of the there's been some certificate shaming going on the internet with people who have, or with companies who have created, long duration or long expiration certificates with SHA-1 hashes. And, it is an interesting thing that I guess we really have to make sure we build into the ecosystem these days is, right now it's SHA-256, SHA-512 are the kind of the new hotness. Right, but at some point, presumably, even those will I don't think they'll necessarily fall by brute force, but they'll probably fall by some other, means of expeditious cracking.
It seems inevitable, and I think the point is that we have got to architect with the concept that we're going to have to plug and replace. The hashes and the protocols and the libraries of most of our cryptography on a regular basis.
Exactly.
And, this should no longer catch us by surprise, but it does. If you look at, for instance, I work in the payment card industry, and so many of the terminals out in the field are hard-coded, if you will, or at least very difficult to update to new sorts of encryption libraries. So you literally have to replace the hardware to upgrade them. And, that seems like a short-sighted design decision. And certainly, I don't know all the things that go into it. I don't know why that very well could have been decided and thought about and said, yep, we're going to make this trade-off. But when I think about it, it's like, this is going to happen again and again and again and again. Yep. Right? So how do we architect in such a way that we don't keep shooting ourselves in the foot when this happens again?
Well, I'm not sure necessarily that it's shooting ourselves in the foot as much as it's just that we have to plan, for things that are modern to at some point be obsolete and defeatable based on new technology and new understanding. And so I really think that just comes down to the design of the components and software and systems to be modular enough that you can plug, you can pull things out and plug things in. And the other thing that we have to be cognizant of, and I don't think we fully, as an industry, really have our head wrapped around how long some of these things can be around for.
Right.
I think the average company likes to think that they're gonna, their customers are gonna renew or refresh their stuff every 3 to 5 or 7 years, and it's just not the case.
No, yeah, and there's always going to be things out there that's around. I mean, the upside is, I think you were sort of hinting at this too, is this may be a good example case to bring to an executive to say, hey, we really need to fix this problem.
Yep.
If you've got some SHA-1 hanging around someplace for various functionality. Now, to be fair, it's still a really theoretical attack, relatively speaking, but it's now no longer non-trivial to make a collision. So this could start cropping up.
Yeah, and it's only going to get easier too.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean. Yeah.
Anyway, so that actually wasn't even on the list of stories, but
no, just us freestyling.
And so moving on to our first actual story, and this one comes from let's see, from CSO Online, and the title here is "Bleeding Clouds: Cloudflare server errors blamed for leaked customer data." So yeah, this was the other big hoopla that happened.
What's really funny is the guy who found this really didn't want to call it Bleeding Clouds, but he even put that in his notes, and well, it got called to that anyway. Yeah. No, it starts off. So just jumping ahead in the story, this was found by Tavis over at the Google Project Zero. He finds a lot of stuff, so this is, he's a pretty interesting guy and contributes a lot to the vulnerability world. But he starts off his whole post with, "It took every ounce of my strength not to call this issue Cloud Bleed." Well, guess what? It got called Cloud Bleed.
It's Cloud Bleed.
So now, even if you try not to name it, it's going to get named.
There it is.
Have we? So we've got a name. Clearly, we've got a logo. I've seen those floating around. I don't know if the mascot has been voted on by the IETF yet, and I believe the theme song is being worked on by. I think the Backstreet Boys are working on the theme song right now.
Good. Yeah. Well, I look forward to hearing that.
Yeah, I think they might rebrand as the Backdoor Boys, but that in the context of vulnerabilities makes sense. But they realize that there might be some branding issues.
Yeah,
I'm going to let that go.
Other connotations. Yep, I get it.
So back to the story.
Yeah. So this actually started off pretty interestingly. A week ago Friday, Tavis had tweeted out. And at the time, a lot of people thought this was pretty ominous, and as it turns out, rightly so.
And also, he caught some flack.
Yeah.
There's a whole lot of drama around this, actually.
So Tavis tweeted out asking if anybody had a security contact at Cloudflare because he needed to urgently talk to someone. And
then people are coming back like, "Why don't you just Google it, dude? Or, this is not responsible. How could you not just look it up on LinkedIn?"
Yep.
Look, lazy web. I get it.
That's right. I mean, hey, why not?
But
plus, it furthers the mystique, right?
Right, and clearly it was indeed. And then, jumping forward just a little bit, when did this release? When did this come out? Tuesday?
Yeah. It was Wednesday, I think. Wednesday night.
Wednesday, yeah. Assuming it was Wednesday. Tuesday, there was hints out there. I saw some people tweeting, "Tomorrow's going to be a bad day. Buckle up."
Yeah. So the story here is that Cloudflare, which is a big content distribution network that a lot of websites use, in particular because they actually offer a free a free tier of service. And one of their big claims to fame is they'll help you write out a DDoS attack, and I think there's been a fair number of those lately where Cloudflare has kind of declared victory from. So anyway, it's a very popular platform with websites, and particularly large websites. Well, apparently what happened was that sometime last year, Cloudflare was replacing some old code with some new code. It was a HTML parser, so they had an old long-in-the-tooth HTML parser that they were replacing with a new one. They were running the two side by side. And in the course of running the two side by side, they actually triggered a pre-existing bug in the old version of the parser. And what happened was the parser would overrun its buffer in certain circumstances. And when that happened, and it wasn't a common thing. It was like one, at the peak, it was like 1 out of every 3.3 million transactions. But, for a really busy CDN, that probably happened, maybe several times a second, I'm guessing. Anyway, the proxies, their edge proxies had this buffer overflow, or I should say it's a buffer overrun, and subsequent pages being served would include unrelated HTML, right? So it could include cookies and content from other web pages, that was authenticated.
So I'm looking at my cute cat video.
Yep.
And a portion of somebody's, I don't know, private chat on OkCupid might be included in the web page that comes back.
Or even better, your 1Password, because 1Password now does their online.
No.
No, I thought that was LastPass that said no, but 1Password was yes.
1Password, the only. So let's be clear on this, because this was a big deal.
Okay.
There's a lot of drama around this. So let's circle back around on this because it's important. But just to spoiler warning, what got leaked on the 1Password side was just API transaction data with no actual sensitive data.
Okay.
Okay, let me be fair. According to what I saw 1Password put out, and other people verified that the 1Pass data that was being seen was still inline encrypted API communications, is my understanding.
Okay.
So, because people started panicking on that one, and there was a whole bunch of back and forth about that. 1Pass is behind Cloudflare, but they apparently did their own thing as well. Yeah, they were beyond TLS.
Yeah, Tavis said he was seeing session data from 1Password.
Yeah, so I'll see if I can find it as we're talking, but because it's a big deal. But the other thing that's interesting is, so I'm a standard web browser, and this is one thing I don't know. I'm getting this dummy data back. I'm wondering if my web browser is even rendering it in any way, or I even know it as the average user, or if it's just being discarded by my renderer as dummy bad data.
So as far as I can tell, there were a bunch of different manifestations of that. So in some web pages, it was kind of mixed in at the top. In a lot of others, apparently it was kind of hidden, right? So
right.
It was there, and actually was largely indexed by Google and other search engines. Which
makes sense in that it depends on, if they're crawling it, they're probably going to be getting that data.
Right.
I guess it depends on how you parse that data, and how it's given to you. Because especially with a buffer overrun, it may be gibberish if you don't see the full context.
Correct.
So circling back on the 1Pass thing. So I found an article in Macworld on this, just for reference. It's Cloudflare data leakage doesn't reveal 1Password secrets. But 1Password.com doesn't use a simple login procedure in which a username and password allows access to stored data and transfer to a secure web connection. Rather, the company's security model expects that an HTTPS connection is vulnerable, so it's only one of only 3 layers employed inside the HTTPS connection. Now, let's be clear. What was leaking here was the HTTPS connections. AgileBits, that's who owns 1Password, uses a second method of transport security. The web browser and server validate each other's identity from when the account was created without sending a password that can be exposed by the Cloudflare leak. Once validated, the server creates an encryption key that, again, isn't sent over the internet, but derived from that mutually confirmed information. And the data inside that second wrapper remains encrypted. So, in essence, it is correct that he was seeing 1Password communications, but they were still encrypted. According to this particular article and other stuff I've read and Twitter posts and such.
Makes sense. But by the way, that only impacts you if you use the online version,
correct,
which is relatively new,
right, as opposed to the browser plugin or something else.
Right.
So, quoting from the security chief of AgileBits, quote, "We designed 1Password from the outset with the expectation that TLS could fail. So if some traffic is exposed through a TLS value, it doesn't cause any problems," which makes sense when you think about man-in-the-middle attacks, things like your AV intercepting your TLS for inspection, all sorts of things. It's probably a wise design move on their part.
Yep.
So I've got no dog in the hunt with 1Password, but I just want to be accurate in our information.
Good point. But there apparently were conversations and a fair amount of actual data from sites like Uber and OkCupid and others. And apparently there were a total of potentially 4 million domains involved.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So that's
which is interesting, because now we've got another story about the centralization around a few key service providers.
Yep.
Right?
Yep, that's right.
We were talking about this with things like email and other stuff, and here and Dyn and whatnot. Now here we are again, where we've got a centralized provider who, in theory, is the subject matter experts, having a flaw that impacts a huge chunk of people, providers on the internet.
Yeah. So there's a second story, also from CSO, and the title there is "Carter's Capitalize on Cloudflare Problems."
But before we move off this,
yeah, go ahead.
I do think that there's an interesting thing, which is that this was fixed, I think, in something like 22 business hours.
Yeah, I did want to touch on that. The blog post from Cloudflare, they actually were quite transparent.
Yes, and I didn't realize you wanted to circle back on that.
Yeah, they talked about how they had actually mitigated the problem within, I think, 45 minutes of learning about it, and then they had pushed out code fixes within something like 7 hours. So it was
and I will give kudos to Cloudflare. Their transparency, I think, is the right way to handle these sorts of situations. I think they did a really good job.
Yeah.
Explaining what happened and why, and I think the way they mitigated was they identified that there was 3 particular services that were lightly used that were the source of the problem. They just turned those off.
Right.
Now, of course, the issue is if that stuff is still indexed and cached out of various search providers, that's an issue. I believe Google is scrubbing, but I don't know if any others are yet.
Yeah, I'm not sure either.
One other funny thing, that Cloudflare offered Tavis a T-shirt.
Yeah, that was kind of funny.
Which caused now. There's also a whole. We're not here to talk about the drama, but it's interesting that there's a whole bunch more drama that came about with how this was disclosed, and it spun up that whole responsible disclosure debate again.
Yeah. Well, it's
people sniping back and forth.
But I don't think Tavis, as far as I can tell, wasn't. He didn't spill the beans. He actually did contact Cloudflare and worked with them, and Cloudflare acknowledged that in their blog post. Which, by the way, I highly recommend everybody read the blog post, because they describe the process they went through and the things they had done to prepare themselves for responding to this kind of an incident, which I thought is really a very good read and something to take to heart. It's an unfortunate thing, and I'll tell you, there's been a ton of discussion. I've seen people contacting me and whatnot, asking, if you're a customer, what do you do? Right? And there's no good answers, unfortunately, because you don't necessarily know what kind of what or if your data was affected. So you kind of have to assume the worst case scenario, right?
Yeah, it's a tough situation to diagnose and recover from, because you don't, like you said, you don't know. You don't know if your passwords are exposed. You don't know if nothing was exposed.
Right.
And this could be one that you may be able to dodge a bullet on, but We'll see. And which leads to the story you were about to launch into when I derailed you back into the original story.
Yeah. So the second story is just basically a continuation of the first, which is titled "Carter's Capitalizing Cloudflare Problems Claim 150 million logins for sale." So there's a Carter forum on the internet that's claiming to have 150 million logins from sites that were impacted by the cloud bleed bug, including sites like Uber and Netflix. But wait, Netflix doesn't use Cloudflare.
My theory is it's probably old data that they're trying to dump.
Yeah. Yeah. So there could be some new data, but I guess this is being sold for $250,000. And hey, is there honor among thieves? I don't know. Right?
But here's the problem with that sort of format is that if they're trying to be a repeat seller, they get a reputation. That is a problem.
Well, yeah, that's certainly true. So anyway, the premise seems a little suspicious, right?
Yeah.
Now I'm sure there definitely were probably some amount of credentials leaked. The 150 million number seems really excessive.
Especially this rapidly?
Yeah.
I'm very skeptical.
Yeah. But, it's hard to prove a negative, I suppose.
Yeah.
But anyway, kind of going back to the original point, it does seem like Cloudflare did the best they could in the situation they had. The actual mechanics of the bug was incredibly simple. They just and in fact it was kind of a dumb bug, right? Because it was C code. It was written by a scripting language, and the scripting language just created an equality check. It was looking for the end of a buffer, and it was trying to do a direct comparison rather than to see if it was greater than or equal to. And if it had been greater than or equal to, none of this would have happened. and to their credit, by the way, throughout the post, Cloudflare's post, they keep pointing out that the things that went wrong, but they owned it. Right? They're like, this was not a problem with the parser; it was a problem with the way we used the parser.
Right.
And so, I kudos for them. They messed up. We don't really know how bad the impact is. May not know for a long time, but they're owning it. So
yeah, and it was in theory quickly resolved, which is circling back the upside of centralizing your services in a couple of providers. They can also fix a huge chunk of their customers at once.
Yes,
right. So it's a double-edged sword.
Right.
If this were, think about this. If this had been something like a Heartbleed, which is still, I think I saw a report the other day, 500,000 vulnerable devices still out on the internet open.
Yep.
If you have a centralized problem, you can also have a centralized solution. So this is the double-edged sword there.
Yeah. It is something, I'll tell you, that regulators are becoming really interested in the concentration of risk problems that these central providers create. And, I guess it's just dependent on your point of view, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. You get, if everybody is responsible for doing their own thing, right, you get a lot of crap. But at the same time, not everything is going to break at the same time from the same cause, right? And that's the fundamental dichotomy we have here, right? You either have the monolithic thing that's robust, but when it breaks, it's horrible, or you have a lot of little things that are prone to failure that take down individual sites.
But there's a flip side of this that I think the auditors may not always look at, which is, yes, there's a concentration of risk, but there's also a concentration of expertise and a concentration of mitigation.
Yeah. But at the same time, though, I guess it depends on what what risk or what harm or peril are you trying to cover, right? Because if it's downtime, then if the whole problem with Cloudflare would have been downtime, like this would have been an awesome story, but the problem is it's not that. It was data disclosure.
Right.
And you can't unring the bell. Like that data is out there.
Security Dog agrees.
I hear that. She's not happy.
Yeah, it's a tough. Here's why I'm sort of harping on this: is that I think it's inevitable. We're going that way. We're not going to get away from centralizing on best of breed providers. It makes
Absolutely.
too much business sense. It's the whole don't do something that isn't your core competency writ large. We are now commoditizing the internet as plumbing, and it's just got to happen.
Absolutely, it is the end game.
Now
IT.
you could use two different providers, but that doesn't stop a data leakage issue necessarily.
Right.
So this is why I keep coming back to this concept, because I'm struggling with it and I just don't see it stopping.
Well, it doesn't need to be stopped. I guess.
Well, I think where I'm going with this is that regulators are going to have to get on board. They're going to have to find a way to deal with it.
From a regulator perspective, it actually has there's an upside, right? Because now they only have one or two places to go, kick them in the teeth.
Well, that's true.
Right. So, if you got all of your regulated entities using Cloudflare, I mean, just hypothetically, right? Mm-hmm. And you're worried about, whatever, right? Now you only have to go to Cloudflare. You only have to go to them and beat them up.
Right.
So anyway, moving on to our next story, which comes from bleepingcomputer.com, and the title is "Malware Used to Attack Polish Banks Contained False Flags Blaming Russian Hackers." I know. Can you believe this?
I personally
can you believe it?
Shocked.
I mean,
who would be so low to fake attribution information?
I cannot believe it. This
First of all,
shatters everything in InfoSec land.
Are there no limits? Is there nothing we can believe in?
It seems like no. So anyway, we talked last week about the the spate of attacks against the Polish bank and the linkage to Mexican banks and an alleged link to the SWIFT attacks and whatnot. And so this particular article is talking about how a researcher for BAE Systems, looking at the malware used in the Polish banks, found some Russian words, which apparently this person speaks fluent Russian, and determined that the Russian words were kind of like brain dead plants, intended.
When he did the Google Translate, rather than actually copying and pasting the true translation, he translated the phonetic pronunciation.
Right, but so I was thinking about this. If you were the Russian military hackers,
that's true.
Wouldn't you do this?
So clearly, I cannot choose the wine in front of you.
Yes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. However, if I knew that the Russian hackers might be smart enough to do this, I might do it to look like the Russian hackers are smart enough to do this.
Correct. But if you knew that, see?
What I think this means is attribution is fucking hard. And every time you hear somebody say, clearly it was a nation state,
but you know what?
A kitten dies.
So they actually go into blaming. It's not Russia; it's North Korea.
Well, clearly, I mean, that went without stating. I didn't even think we had to say that, did we? No.
But what I find interesting though is the allegation here is that this this Polish bank attack, which was apparently related to an attack in Mexico and in Uruguay, is apparently also related to the SWIFT bank, the SWIFT $81 million theft, and dun dun dun, the Sony hack.
Right.
All apparently done by this Lazarus group.
And they're basing it upon similarity of the code and the attack methodology, right?
Right. They're using the same API, dynamic API loading techniques, and the same Enigma protector code packing system.
Which nobody else on the planet could possibly use.
Nope.
Not allowed. Not permitted.
Nope.
They have filed copyright on that particular technique.
And they're not allowed to change their their time zones or the language set on their computer. None of that. It's against the rules.
It's true. It's true. So we're making light of this, but in all seriousness, this is the challenge when people say authoritatively, based on code review, that it's group XYZ. They might be right, but it doesn't have to be. Unless a group is absolutely not sharing their data with anybody and didn't get their data from anybody and self-developed it entirely, how can you ever really know if multiple groups aren't using the same code packages?
Yeah, and you know what kills me is we make this assumption that it takes a nation state to have the resources to develop some of these super sophisticated pieces of malware, but then we also seem to make the assumption that they're also not sophisticated enough to make it look like it was the work of whoever they wanted it to look like.
Right.
And by the way, I'm not saying that it's not a nation state. I mean, I'm just saying that we don't know who the hell it was.
Right. Yeah. I think that's fundamentally it is. We can't say authoritatively.
Yeah. Anyway, it just gets under my skin.
I'm sorry.
It's all right.
I don't want you to get upset about this.
No, it's fine. It's fine. So so here's one more thing to get upset about. SecurityWeek.com has a story called "This is what hackers think of your defenses," and yeah,
this is my fault.
I know. Damn you, Andy. So this company called Nuix, I guess is how you say it, did a survey of hackers, and I used air quotes there, and by hackers they mean penetration testers at DEF CON in 2016. And so they asked them a whole bunch of questions. And
just for the question, why did it take them from August to February to publish this?
I believe, don't know for sure, but I believe it was time to coincide with RSA. The marketing conference.
That's right. Yes. Marketers got to market, man.
Marketers got to market.
All right, carry on.
That's right. So there's when you read the actual report, they're trying to differentiate themselves with this report from the the Verizon report and some of the other big data breach reports, and they're looking at it a different way and saying not how did breaches happen, they're saying how do people who breach systems do it. And so that's kind of an interesting take, but they don't seem to really address the obvious bias that creates. But be that as it may, they had a couple of interesting stats they pulled into the article. So, for instance, that 88% of these hackers claim that they can compromise their intended targets within 12 hours, and then 80% of them can exfiltrate data within another 12 hours. And they contrast that with the 250 to 300 days that it usually takes to detect a breach. And the thing that's made me, or that struck me when I looked at that contrast, is that if you have a IT department or a security department that doesn't detect a breach within, I don't know, hours or a day or 2 days, it's probably not going to be detected by that organization.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, either you're going to pick it up on it. Well, that's a really interesting point. I got to think about that one for a little bit. I guess it depends on where you're instrumented and what sort of detection technology you have. It's entirely possible you might miss the initial breach, but then when lateral movement occurs or escalation movement, you might pick that up, or when they start poking at sensitive data, if you've got that more protected. That's an interesting question, right? Because you're somewhat assuming that if you're not spotting the initial behavior that led to the breach, what are you going to spot?
Yeah, it's I guess somewhat of a rhetorical question, but it is an interesting thing to think about, and so. If my guess is if we had perfect data, the ability to kind of look at perfect data, we would see, a cluster of companies detecting breaches, within hours and days, and then you would see the rest of it heavily skewed towards third parties finding it. On carding sites, right, or whatever.
And being notified.
Right.
Yeah, and then they start looking at logs and they see the signal.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. I'm just not thinking that companies are going back and looking at 200-day-old logs and saying, "Oh my goodness, look at that."
Yeah, something gave them a heads up.
Right. Whether
some other defense was tripped, some other detection was tripped, or they get a third-party heads up, or the county password inspector comes by and mentions it. Something happens.
Yep. Exactly. So they did talk about how they did mention that a third of, kind of in line with this, a third of them say they're not detected by the security teams. Let's see. Then they talk a lot about training and qualifications, and they say that 70% of employers, I'm not really sure where this, I guess it came from an ISACA survey, sorry. 70% of employers require a certificate for IT security people, but 75% of the people that were surveyed in this don't believe that certificates are an accurate measure of knowledge or competence. So it's probably not a big surprise there. Then they talked about, again, specifically talking about these penetration testers. 4% of them had more than 10 certs, and 66% had less than 3. And, penetration testers are such a narrow percentage of the overall IT security workforce. It's kind of an odd thing for them to be calling out. But, whatever. The one thing that, by the way, if you're interested in getting into penetration testing, I think this is a great report to read, because it talks about a lot of the, kind of behaviors and where do they spend their time? Where do these penetration testers spend their time? What are they reading? What are they studying? Those sorts of things. So it's an interesting report from that perspective. Let's see what other. I went through the report and found some other things. They said 10% of these penetration testers were concerned with firewalls. 2% were concerned with antivirus. 36% say that modern endpoint security protection is effective, which is interesting. Kind of tells me maybe there's a big variation in the competence of these penetration testers, and rather than necessarily anything intrinsic with the big environment. And they didn't really seem to address that. 25% of them said there were no controls that could stop them. And that's kind of the other end of the spectrum was God complex people.
Right.
I have a pair of scissors that
yeah, and a dog that will bite through Cat 6 cables.
That's right.
One thing that they did point out that I thought was really good advice was from the article, which is actually quoting from the report, quote, "While fix the biggest problems appears to be a logical approach to remediation, and they're talking about once you get the pen test report, it misrepresents the true nature of vulnerabilities and provides a false sense of security for decision makers, warns the report. Quote, if you only address specific vulnerabilities that have been chosen arbitrarily and devoid of context, it's the cybersecurity equivalent of taking an aspirin for a brain tumor. You're addressing a symptom as opposed to the root cause. End quote. I think that is a really valid and valuable observation, which is that when you have a pen test and they exploit, they're figuring out one methodology to exploit. If you're not looking at the core root cause of that methodology or of that class of problems, or fundamentally how that data is being protected, you're missing out on the point of the pen test.
Yep.
It's basically like saying, I ran my vulnerability scanner, and as soon as I found the first vulnerability, I stopped scanning that server. And I fixed that one vulnerability, and I'm good. There could be dozens more.
Yep.
So that is especially when you're doing annual pen tests, I really do. They're valuable. They're helpful. I'm not dogging on them, but if you only fix what's identified in the report and you don't look at the bigger picture, you look at the problem behind that problem, you do get a false sense of security.
Yeah, and they went a little bit further, at least in one of the graphs, talked about how 10% of the respondents said that they typically saw all of the findings remediated on a subsequent pen test. 75% found some amount of remediation, and 5% found no remediation. So interesting stats there. 30% of the test penetration testers surveyed said they believed they were employed solely for compliance purposes.
Yeah, absolutely. Why? Because compliance generates funding.
Yeah.
I get budget for compliance.
Yeah, and then there were a bunch of kind of gee whiz numbers, like how often do you use social engineering, and do you use vulnerability scanners, which seem really odd questions to ask a population of people, because presumably they're all going to have different tactics that they use. They did say 60% use open source tools. I thought that was interesting. 43%. But by the way, that doesn't mean that, I assume that doesn't mean they only used open source tools. 40.
And they're not burn or no days, that's for sure.
Yeah, 43% attack servers directly, and 40% are using phishing. So, those are.
So here's the problem: is we don't know what sort of criteria and rules are placed around these pen tests.
Yes, that's exactly, so especially with social engineering, there are a lot of pen test engagements where the company who is hiring the test out does not want that. I mean, there's a lot of artificial,
especially if you look at things for compliance like PCI.
Yes.
Test that website.
Right.
Okay.
Not anything around it.
Nope. just that website.
Yep.
Well, that's a really false sense of security.
Right.
They're testing one particular vector.
Right. It would be interesting is to ask, if kind of hindsight's 2020, right? What is from their perspective, what are the most effective methods, right? Not necessarily how often do you do a social engineering test or a phishing test. It's what is the most effective means in your experience? Is it is it social engineering / phishing? Is it something else? And I'm going to guess that it's probably social engineering. It's just a situation where they're not always allowed to do it. Right.
I would completely agree. I go back and forth on this. I personally would rather hire the skill set of a pen tester and say, do a white box, open book audit. But it doesn't have the same visceral reaction with executives as we hired these guys to break into us, and they did.
Right. Yep.
So there is a political game here. There is a political aspect of how you go about this to get the funding you need to fix things. I don't like it, but it is what it is. And to be effective with our organizations, we have to figure that out.
Yep. There were two other interesting stats I saw in there for varying reasons. One of them was that 9% of the penetration testers said that they never encounter a system they can't break, but never is described as 0 to 5% of the time. So
never with a a bit of air. Suddenly, I'm blanking on the term. What's the statistical term for level of air?
Yeah, it's a confidence interval. Yes.
Yeah.
So that was a little bothersome to me, and then which kind of sets the whole stage for how you want to read a report like this. But and then they said that 50% of the testers changed their methodology with every engagement, which I thought was really interesting. I would have expected, and maybe this is just terminology things, right? But I would have expected not to not see that kind of variation.
Margin of error. That's the term.
Margin of error. There you go.
Suddenly, see, it's late on a Sunday and I'm getting Alzheimer's.
Well, that's because you're old.
I haven't listened to a thing you've said until I figured that out, too. I was like, damn it, I need to figure out what I said.
All right. So moving on to our last story for this evening. And this is just a quick follow-up from the Yahoo breach. Actually, Yahoo breaches. So
I don't think you're pronouncing that correctly.
Yahoo?
There you go.
Damn it. Anyway, there was a story, I guess, sometime last year about how Verizon was trying to get a $1 billion discount off of the $5 billion price or so. And, well, they didn't get that much off, but they did end up getting a discount of $350 million, which is pretty good as a result of the breach. And probably even more importantly, Yahoo has to bear any costs associated with the breach.
That's scary.
Yeah, which is that's even more, to me, that's even more interesting than the $350 million. So, anyway.
Yeah, I mean that's unlimited potential liability. Wow.
Yep. Anyway, that just kind of goes to show how important this stuff can be, right? I mean, that's real money.
How do you think that conversation went? Think it was kind of like, at a used car dealership?
What's it going to take to get this deal done today?
So we know our girl's been beat up a little bit and she's not looking her best, but she's still good for marriage, or because now it's sort of like negotiating a higher dowry, and 200 years ago. This analogy's falling apart on me, but seriously, that had to have been a really uncomfortable conversation.
Oh yeah, well, I would imagine it's been probably uncomfortable for a long time. But that's $350 million.
Yeah,
that's
Now here's an interesting question: if it was 2 years from now, do you think they would have gotten the discount?
I don't know,
because we see so many companies that have breaches, at least tracking their stock price, they bounce back usually within 6 months to a year.
Yeah, so when I first saw the headline, I was thinking that the discount was to offset any potential future losses associated with the breach, but they've included that. They've included that in the price. That's a separate element.
So they've got to assume that the core business that they're buying is now worth less than it was before. So that's
right.
Brand value, current customer base, and future customer base. It's pure value of the company that's been taken away. Which is it's just so it's a really interesting thing, because I guess I'm not entirely clear what the heck Yahoo's business model is anymore, right? But it just doesn't seem like they have a giant brand that's been tarnished by this. So I'm really interested to know what the math it was, but obviously we'll never get to hear that. But yeah,
interesting story. But it kind of shows this is why what we do is important.
Well, nearly 10% discount,
right?
But I go back to, if they weren't in the middle of negotiations, would it have been so severe? I don't know.
Yeah, maybe not. I mean, look, Marissa Mayer she can only have like 5 mansions instead of 7.
So interestingly, I was just reading the actual press release. Under the amended terms, Yahoo will be responsible for 50% of any cash liabilities incurred following. Not
it's
all
50%.
of it.
Okay.
Half of it. So liabilities following the closing related to non-SEC government investigations and third-party litigation related to the breaches. Liabilities arising from shareholder lawsuits and SEC investigations will continue to be the sole responsibility of Yahoo.
That was what I read. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
So, interesting. So shareholder lawsuits and SEC lawsuits or investigations will be Yahoo. Non-shareholder, non-SEC will be 50-50.
Right. Interesting.
Which is interesting because Yahoo's responsible, but they're owned by Verizon.
Well,
that's more of a P&L game.
Yeah, I wonder how that will work.
Well, it
out.
could also limit the liability to the parent company.
True.
If there were,
and I imagine that they're probably going to hold the stock separately.
That would make sense.
Right, and so that any chargebacks will go against the shareholders of Yahoo, the Yahoo portion. So, anyway, interesting stuff. This is real money, right? That we're actually starting to see some big dollars associated with bad cyber behavior. So, anyway, that is it for this week. I just want to point out 3 weeks in a row.
It's amazing.
Here we go. Let's go for 4. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And as always, thank you very much to our Patreon donors. You guys are amazing. Still boggles my mind. I don't even know what to say to show you my appreciation.
Thank you much. And if you want to find links to the stories, you can go to our website at www.defensivesecurity.org. You can follow the show on Twitter at DefensiveSec. You can follow Mr. Khaled on Twitter at Lurg and me on Twitter at MaliciousLink. And with that, we will talk again next week. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Everybody.